The following recording is part one of a new podcast hosted by Matt Leary of Newgrange Design, Geoffrey Hazelett of FreedomCAD, and myself, Mike Buetow of the Printed Circuit Engineering Association. This podcast is so new, in fact, we don't even have a name for it yet, but we are open to suggestions. Gentlemen, we have a guest coming up, but before we introduce him, I'd like to call your attention to what I think is a huge unfolding story. The announcement by Nippon Denkai that it plans to shut down and liquidate its copper foil manufacturing plant in Augusta, Georgia, which is the last such factory in the United States. Now, I want to point out that Denkai America opened that site just a couple of years ago, having invested several tens of millions of dollars. However, according to Denkai, the plant lost $23 million combined in its 2023 and 2024 fiscal years. Now, the company is citing financial problems stemming from semiconductor shortages, a decrease in exports of batteries manufactured domestically, lower demand for smartphones. Obviously, they haven't seen my house, and other factors for the decision. So the issues, as I see it, are the obvious supply chain concern. That is, despite a growing worldwide market for PCBs, suppliers are still seeing price pressure and being forced to consolidate or close. And this is particularly dire for the US, where in order for the manufacturing base to grow, the supply base must be self-sustaining as well. That clearly isn't happening right now. Second, and particular to the US, is the security issue of not having a domestic source of a critical material. Now, the US government can, by law, step in when there is a threat of a critical military shortage. And I have heard from suppliers in the U.S. who have reached out to CFIUS, which is the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States. However, it is unclear to me at present whether anything will come of that. So, to my fellow podcasters, Geoffrey Hazelett and Matt Leary, I ask you, what should we make of all this?
I'm concerned to hear this. It's a bad sign for the future of manufacturing in the United States. It's a vulnerability. It seems to fly in the face of the effort we're trying to put forward with the CHIPS Act to reinvigorate the manufacturing base in the United States and to try to protect against this kind of vulnerability that things have to be purchased overseas. So I find it to be concerning. I'm also sort of curious what other parts of the manufacturing process are a single source in the United States and are at risk of this kind of vulnerability. I think that's something I'd be curious about as well.
Yeah, touching into that, what about glass weave and the glass? I thought that we weren't getting, for the laminates that were even being manufactured in the U.S., that wasn't even being done in the U.S. We were importing it from, is it Japan? Mike or Matt, are you guys familiar with these sources?
Taiwan, I thought.
Taiwan, okay. Still East Asia. So we look at it and go, is this just another block moving out? I'd be kind of interested to see, there's some of the stuff going on right now with our neighbors, but it'd be interesting if one of these, Mexico or Canada, spun up a copper facility. I could totally see that being something Mexico jumping on, saying, hey, well, we'll take that. There's a lot going on near shore at the moment. So maybe we can't do it locally here in the U.S., but maybe some of our neighbors could pick that up.
Well, just so that you know, CF Luxembourg has a distribution site through Canada. They may actually manufacture there. I'm not entirely sure. Our guest might know. So I think what it says to me is we maybe better not piss them off too badly in the course of everything else that's going on.
The Canadians, not the Luxembourgians.
The Canadians, correct. Thank you. We need their hockey players.
Yeah.
Okay. We need their copper foil.
Fair.
And maybe we need the cheap place to go because it's like a 25% discount every time you cross the border and buy anything.
Beautiful country, beautiful people as well. So.
Wait, are you talking about Luxembourg or Canada again?
Both, actually. Both? Yes, I say both. Another area I would say I would be curious if you went through the different supplies that are needed to manufacture a printed circuit board and identified where the sources of these come from. And that would be an interesting exercise, I think. And then how many we can get domestically, how many sources there are domestically, where are their vulnerabilities here? I think that's a worthwhile exercise, maybe not for us to do, but for somebody to do. And I would say partnering not just Mexico and Canada, but South America. I feel like that, first of all, there's a decent amount of supply of copper coming out of South America. It seems like that might be a natural fit. And I feel much less vulnerable. Something, Geoffrey, you mentioned is even our partners in Asia, they're still in Asia, which is much closer, and it's not quite, there's some geographical advantages to doing some of this stuff in the Americas, even if it's not North America, I think, from a security standpoint.
Certainly.
So with that, I think we should segue into our first guest ever. Geoffrey Leeds is the founder of Leeds LLC, which aims to help manufacturers turn their factories into data mines to start the process, or by helping them set up tried and proven internal data science workflows to enable AI. There's that word. Before launching his company, Geoffrey spent about a decade as a process engineer and project manager in the printed circuit space, where, among other things, he designed and developed artificial intelligence proof of concept products and led company Industry 4.0 team efforts to integrate product offerings and data collection within the electronics manufacturing marketplace. So welcome, Geoffrey Leeds.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me on board.
Geoffrey, it's great to have you here. We just thought right out of the gate it would be nice and confusing to have our guest have the same exact name. We're not going Jeff or anything like that. It's two Geoffreys right out of the gate, one of our hosts and one of our guests. So,
and as Geoffrey and I know, there's a council of Geoffreys that, for those of us who spell our name with a G, infrequently we gather together, have meetings, decide things, and because we have such good rapport, I immediately thought, let's bring him on. I know this guy knows things. He's lively, and he can talk eloquent words for us.
I appreciate the high praise. Us Geoffreys do need to stick together. If anyone else spells their name Geoffrey and with a G, please reach out to us. We don't allow those who have two Fs to spell it PH, however. It has to have two Fs. I think that is the only rule we have, other than it must be spelled with a G. So I do know things. I appreciate that. And I think your guys' initial comments on supply chain vulnerabilities and what's going on in terms of the U.S. PCB laminates market space is really on the nose. We're spending all this money, $50 billion on the CHIPS Act to go after one portion of the electronic supply chain, only to realize that that's probably not going to be enough to sustain us. I vividly remember just a few years ago watching someone from a DoD prime get up and start discussing about if we build the wafers here, it still has to go overseas for processing because we don't have any of the support facilities required to take the wafer and actually put it into a form that we can put into a PCBA line itself. And that was, for me, the biggest wake-up call that it wasn't just PCBs that were concerned about how ICs were getting all of the attention. It's the interposer, it's all of the OSATs, it's the metrology equipment required, it's the small post-processing and outside shops required to get there. How do you dice these different wafers and put them together? It's all required to have a healthy ecosystem get on shored. And we definitely have gone past that critical mass tipping point, right? Of it's a it's a downward spiral, and it's only, the way I'd like to phrase it is it's the feedback loop is self-fulfilling at this point, right? It's an unbounded gain in terms of where we are headed. The nearshoring exercises all kicked off, moving into Mexico. I think it was like right after the Trump tariffs and when he first came into office, was supply chains immediately pivoted to go through the Philippines. I had a number of friends when I was working in Silicon Valley that worked at some of the big tech companies, and they were all talking about how they're trying to minimize costs and still get it into the U.S. and bypass these tariffs. And it first started to go through the Philippines while they started to spin up operations in Mexico. Because if you get it to Mexico and then into the U.S., you're able to keep price parity as much as possible. So Mexico got built up in about 2 years. And now everything's coming in through, Latin America, essentially. But other critical supplies outside of just PCBAs for us would be as the news story was, which is copper foil. And Jeff, you brought up a great point, e-glass. My understanding is that all e-glass is imported into the US.
Yeah.
So Isola, EMC, I think they've got an operation, and there's a couple other small operations here in the US that do coating. So they'll take the e-glass, they'll take the resin, they'll put it through the treater to make your prepregs. That e-glass is imported. And there was an e-glass shortage a few years ago. I remember that very vividly while working at Inselectro and talking to our customers, was that they couldn't get laminates and they were all under allocation. And then there was the port issue. I remember tracking the ship that was sitting at Long Beach International Port and waiting for when it would get in line. And my wife and I went out to Catalina Island, and there's 20 ships sitting there waiting to go through the port. It was a nightmare. So now that we're losing this critical infrastructure again, or another piece of it, it's just going to further exacerbate and keep the U.S. on this essential island of where, we are completely beholden to suppliers from overseas in order to make our most critical infrastructure and our most critical components that give us a technological edge. We do all the design here in the US, but we do almost none of the fab. I think the last number is 4% of the PCB marketplace is built here in the US. And of that 4%, 60% of it is defense related. So I have a hard time to think that the defense industrial base would allow Denkai to go under. But part of me thinks that they just might, because they haven't done anything until this point otherwise. So it, to me, is just, it's another sad thing to see, but it's unfortunately, I think, where microelectronics in the US is currently headed.
Well, if the US has to be on an island, can it please be Catalina?
Yeah, that'd be nice. I might throw my hat into Hawaii. Personally.
Yeah, I was going to go Hawaii to interject.
Catalina's pretty close though. So
long flight from Boston.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, we are
not the Isles of Shoals, Mike. That's not where you're looking for, but okay, fine. Nice New Hampshire islands.
I want warmer, Matt.
Fair. Geoffrey, I want to just make sure we're understanding the forces at play. That why can't these things be manufactured in the United States? Is it just the cost of labor, or is it the environmental regulations? Are those the two biggest reasons that are preventing us from doing this locally?
So I would definitely say that labor is potentially a huge factor in these decisions. Cost is always going to be the main driver in any manufacturing operation. Cost is king to a certain degree.
We talked about labor costs. The labor costs in the United States are much higher. We talked a little bit about the environmental impact and the regulations. But you've hit on a couple of points. Is they subsidize this in Asia heavily and in Taiwan, and that's something the United States hasn't done. And even this R&D, the lack of subsidy, consistent subsidies for TSMC, we're talking since the early 90s, they've been subsidized. The country has invested in their R&D since the early 90s. So puts the U.S. companies at a disadvantage as far as R&D, and even some of this. Look, let's take a step back and analyze what we're doing here. That's the kind of money that could be Asian companies are getting from their governments that American companies are not getting.
Yeah.
I believe. Is that a fair assessment?
Yep, absolutely. So some of these really harebrained ideas that you can come up with, like, will this technology work for our ecosystem? That's what those governments subsidize, right? Because there's no clear monetization pathway if this tech works for you as a manufacturer. So why would the manufacturer invest into it, right? It doesn't fit their CapEx. I would say, idea of what if I put this money in, where does it help me in the factory floor? It's unknown. And manufacturers aren't willing to take that risk, right? That's where startups can come in and really help. But the startup environment for manufacturing in the US is near zero, because again, it takes a lot of money to even just get a startup going from that perspective. So that's where those overseas, I would say research efforts really pinpoint and go after. Because if you tried to hire a data scientist from Silicon Valley right into a board shop to do really cutting edge stuff, you're going to pay $300,000 to $500,000 a year for that individual, right? Who is expecting that kind of money at a startup plus stock options and others. So that kind of cost is nowhere near attainable for a board shop to justify. And then they're going to, so let's say they even do hire that person. It's like, well, do you even have the data assets required to enable that data scientist to start actually doing what you want them to do? No. And you want the data scientist to be your data engineer and your developer to then build your framework, to then build the data asset and then learn on it. Okay, so they're not going to stay. Or if they do, it's going to take them 3 years to get there. These things don't just magically occur. But that kind of figure it out is what other countries subsidize. And then once they have that figured out, that framework is then transferred to the industrial base. So the industrial base doesn't have to foot that cost themselves. And that's it.
Yes. So you mentioned like South Korea was able to do some of this manufacturing that we complain about, but South Korea, the government invests in this kind of manufacturing that we don't. And that might be the difference between what's going on in South Korea and what's going on. That might be a bigger thing than people think, is that they have invested in this.
Public-private partnerships over there to figure out really challenging problems to then distribute to everybody, who then puts their own twist on it and their own market, which is what all board shops here in the US have. They have their own kind of niches they're good at. But to step up into that next general tech level, let's just put it like that, is something that if it's shared amongst everybody, it gives you the strategic and competitive advantage to sustain. And that's what they do in somewhere like South Korea, where labor costs are some of the highest in the world.
Well, Matt, and I want to add to that, there's also the cost of construction, right? I mean, we know this being in New England, there's a housing shortage, and yet guess what? They're not building more housing. Because it's just too expensive and takes too long to get all the permits and all the rest of that. And now look at it from an industrial construction point of view, okay, where instead of 2 acres, you need 50. And you have all sorts of solvents, wastewater, effluent discharge, all that permitting that needs to happen. It's just a whole nother world of hurt to go through. The process or the speed with which that gets approved and then put into and then executed is much greater than it is here.
Yeah, and the free market, it makes sense to let this work flow overseas and let them do this, except there's this risk that what if there's some geopolitical issues that break out, and now we are at risk of not being able to get this material. And so there's like the conflict between the concepts of free market and what that would warrant would happen, and then the security risks that presents, that I think are also things that as a government, as a country, we need to consider, and how critical this technology is to the way we live and defend ourselves as a country, which is what the CHIPS Act, I think, in principle is supposed to address. But is it trickling down to the board houses and the glass weave and the copper laminate level? Is what it seems like. That's how this all started, this conversation, I think.
I would say it is. You saw the CHIPS Act put money aside for substrates, which is not something that was initially in the charge of the CHIPS Act. And through the NIST's holding of all these different events they've had, they've clearly identified OSATs and back processing capabilities as a clear strategic initiative that we need to facilitate and have on shore. And they have been pushing towards that. So they did carve out a section of money for that. I think that's what the NAPMP is for, the North American Packaging Facility. I always forget what the PMP portion is, but that they are looking into it. And then you're seeing other government entities, and pots of money being, allocated to PCBs, for example. But, it's okay. So we're building the ecosystem a little bit, but, what is going to get us truly sustainable? Is it just a mandate to say, if you buy and sell in America, 4% of the products that you make, right? Because that's all we currently do, has to be made here. And from a risk perspective to those OEMs, it's if you suddenly couldn't get something geopolitically for whatever reason, you still have the ability to make something.